Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. My name is Greg Wadley. I'm the Clear Roads Project Manager with CTC and Associates. We're here today for the final webinar on Clear Roads Project 1503, which is North American Study on Contracting Snow and Ice Response. The principal investigator for this project is Laura Fay, and she's out of the Western Transportation Institute at Montana State University. As I said, this is the final webinar. This is one of the last deliverables for any given project. We always conduct a webinar, and then we'll be recording this webinar and posting it on the website for viewing at a later date. For the duration of this project, I'm going to keep everybody on mute. That way we don't have any disturbances with any background noise or anything like that. So please, if you have any questions or comments, put it in the chat box. And then at the end of the presentation, Laura will address those questions and I'll help her with those. If we have a number of them coming in, I can read them to her and she can respond to them. I'll also put out a note on that in the chat box itself as a reminder to those who are joining us a little bit later. And then at the very end of the presentation, if there's any time left, we'll just go ahead and unmute everybody if it's easier just to handle it that way. But I just want to be sure that we have a nice clean recording. Okay, with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Laura now. Laura, go right ahead.
Great, thank you, Greg. Thank you everyone for participating in this. I know we're sandwiched between holidays right now, so thanks for those who could make it. My name is Laura Fay. I'm the principal PI on this, as Greg said, and this is the final report presentation for the North American Study on Contracting Snow and Ice Response. Before I get started, it sounds like there's some background noise. I don't know if you can hear that, Greg.
I do hear that. Oh, it looks like a couple people aren't muted. Okay, now Laura, I'm sorry, I cut you off there for a second, but that seems to take care of it.
Okay, great. So we'll start over. So this is the final report presentation for the Clear Roads and Minnesota DOT funded project, North American Study on Contracting Snow and Ice Response. This was a group effort by myself and Ambu Muzumani at WTI at Montana State University, with a lot of help from Dave Bergner at Monta Vista Associates and from Mr. Jason Bittner at Applied Research Associates. Because of the way the meeting was scheduled kind of between holidays, not all of the subcontractors were able to make it, but I know that they're happy to help answer any questions if they should come up. So moving forward. There we go. So the objective of this project was to gain an understanding of the state of practice in contracting for snow and ice control by state DOTs. So to set the background and to set the stage for that, snow and ice removal requires instantaneous and efficient response paired with reliable availability of equipment and manpower. And response times are crucial, and every storm is different, demanding a flexibility and the use of limited resources by the state DOTs. Unpredictable winter weather has a profound effect on the overall value of work related to snow and ice removal. And some budget cycles see double or even triple the expected expenditures based on the intensity and the duration of these snow events, confounding issues related to budgeting and staffing. With this uncertainty and the importance of maintaining mobility in winter conditions, many states have adopted alternative delivery approaches for winter maintenance activities. While these contracted activities did not shift the cost of snow responses entirely to outside parties, the contracts are used to provide some stability and ensure an appropriate response to maintain highway infrastructure. So with all that being said, I'd like to present the methods that we used for this project. This was a synthesis style project, and it entailed 4 main tasks, which included a literature search where we looked up all available published research, government reports and documents, and we wrote up a literature review document that was submitted. After that, we used that information to develop a survey questionnaire. It was sent out as an online survey tool. We received 51 responses from 31 U.S. states, which you can see highlighted in blue in the figure on this slide. And we also received responses from 3 different Canadian provinces. So we felt like we had a good sampling of North America in general and their use of contracting for snow and ice control. Information from the survey was written up in a detailed survey response as well as a summary of the survey responses. And that was submitted to the panel for review. And the third task involved combining the information from the literature search and the survey into a synthesis of information. And this is the core of the document. And in the final report, this is chapter 4, and it is titled The Synthesis of Information. And then the final deliverable for this project is the final report and this presentation. A quick outline of the final report. It includes an executive summary, an introduction to the topic of use of contracting for snow and ice response, detailed methodology of all the tasks that were completed, the original literature review, the original survey summary, the developed summary of findings, conclusions and recommendations for moving forward on this topic, and then in the appendices, you can find the detailed survey responses. What I'm going to present in this final report presentation is not all the details of the final report, but instead the summary of findings or the synthesis of information that was developed from all the information that we captured. So jumping into the topic of using contracting for snow and ice control. Why are folks using contracted services? Well, what we found was that changes in level of service expectations were driving this on some level. And this may be in part due to a lack of in-house resources, whether that's people on the ground to operate equipment or funds to support them. And that may be in part because level of service expectations had changed and the in-house resources can no longer accommodate those. Other reasons include movement towards performance-based operating policies. And again, this may be a shift in level of service beyond what the in-house staff was capable of achieving, whether it's actual people present or equipment or just the man hours to accomplish that increased level of service. Contracting is also used for unusual storm events or extreme storm events. When seasonal variations in staff and equipment occur, such as staffing and equipment imbalances that occur between summer and winter operations. And contracted services are also used when staff training and retention appear to be issues. From the survey, we asked folks why they are using contracted services. And as you can see here, the top 2 listed at about 50% response rate are from lack of agency resources. And that's both caps on labor, but also equipment fleet. But you can see that there's still a good almost 25% indicated that state level movement towards privatization or legislative action to include more contracted services was one reason. And another reason is the effort to reduce costs using contracted services, which we'll get to later, but isn't as easy of a yes-no in terms of contracting being less expensive or more expensive. And again, if you'd like to go back and see these figures in detail, they're all included in the final report, which will be on the website. So we've talked about reasons why folks may be using contracted services for snow and ice response. But I think we should also talk about why folks are not using contracted services. And this is really going to become clear as we go through the findings of the report, why this is important. But folks are not using contracted services because they feel like there's an increased cost with the use of these contractors. Some folks feel there's a variation in response time, a potential reduced level of service that's provided. There may be a lack of availability of qualified contractors with the required equipment to meet the level of service guidelines that are being set forth by the agency. Some agencies feel like they have a surplus and efficiency that they can achieve with their in-house staff that are already trained in conducting this work. And then some folks feel like there's a limited ability for the agency itself to actually contract out to the contractors, that there's not the bureaucracy built up within their agency to handle the contracting system. But interestingly, the most commonly cited factor for states to resist contracting services was the desire to retain key skills and expertise, and almost a fear that if they give up snow and ice response 100% to contractors, that they won't have a leveraging tool in the contracting process anymore to say, hey, we need the contractors to perform to this level, or we could just do it ourselves. So we've talked about why folks do contract. We've talked about why folks maybe don't want to contract. Let's look at some of the information that's out there. From the survey, we found that about 50% of the responding agencies indicated that they've had to terminate a contract for snow and ice response in the last 5 years. And the reasoning for most of these occurred was non-performance or poor performance by contractors, which on the outset when you read this might be a little concerning. But then if you consider this, about 15% of the survey respondents, so agencies that are contracting, have partially reverted back from contracting with private companies back to using in-house resources. But they've only partially reverted back. No one has fully reverted back from what we heard. In fact, 86% of people did not revert back, despite the fact that some of these contracts are being ended. And the reason people were partially reverting back actually had to do with non-availability of replacement contractors, so a lack of available contractors to do the work. Another interesting point is that of the contracts that were out there, about 48% of the agencies we spoke to indicated that they had situations where the contractors actually terminated the contract. So this could have been due to bankruptcy of the contractor going out of business, or the contractor being dissatisfied with the pay from the agency and the terms of the contract. So what I'm hearing from all of this is that this contracting with private entities and public agencies is a complicated business. And so let's kind of jump into the contracting process. So state DOTs hire these private contractors or local public agencies, and these could be towns, cities, or counties, for snow and ice control. And the majority of states are using private contractors, and a very limited number of our respondents from the contract are using both private contractors and local public agency staff. So within these, there's 4 main types of contracts that are being used, and I'll go over those briefly. They're provided in detail, or more information on all these contracting types is provided in detail in the report. The first one is called a rental agreement, or these are short-term contracts. These would be used in an extraordinary circumstance, such as a severe storm or an emergency storm management situation. And the terms of these contracts could be such as a fixed annual payment, and this would be based on an estimate that was determined prior to the storm event occurring. They could be based on hourly payment, where labor and equipment costs are folded together, and there may be a minimum guaranteed payment or a minimum amount paid out for the contract, but that may or may not be the case, and that would depend on the contract language. Or they may be paid out on an indexed lump sum, and again, this is based on an estimate, and it could be based on, say, a per lane mile estimate, again, ahead of the storm event occurring, and adjustments to this type of contract could be made based on storm severity. So the amount could be more or less than the original estimate, and there may or may not be a minimum guaranteed paid out amount on that contract. Another type of contract is a defined amount of work contract or a reoccurring work contract. Defined amount of work on a reoccurring basis for the agency may include contracts with local agencies like counties or cities, private individuals, or firms to provide the snow and ice control. Local agencies are often reimbursed for the cost of using the equipment, materials, and workers without profit, so just at the cost for the local agency to perform the work, whereas the private contractor would likely have overhead built into their defined amount for the contract for their profit, essentially. These are usually longer-term contracts and may include indexed payments. The third type of contract is the blended forces contract, and this is both state forces and contractors, and by contractors we mean private firms and potentially public agencies working together to handle the majority of the roadways in a statewide effort. And these can be used in extraordinary circumstances to provide support. And the fourth contracting type, which is less common, is the public-private partnership. And this involves a comprehensive contract mechanism, which may include an asset management contract or tool and public-private partnerships. I believe about 20% of respondents indicated that they've used this type of contract. And from the survey, we asked folks the types of contracts that they're using, and about 50% of folks indicated that they're using agreements for equipment and operators during normal winter circumstances, and that the bulk of the contracts that are being used are longer-term contracts or up to 5 years or more. Shorter-term contracts, 1 to 3 years, are also common at about 36%, as well as fixed lump sum contracts, fixed annual payments for estimated expenditures, regardless of winter severity, are also common. So with contracting, some lessons learned that were identified in the literature review and survey process include the primary observation for contract success is communication, and that's clear, open, and honest partnership between the state and the vendor. What's crucial is that the overall goals of both the contractor and the state need to be the same and need to be the success of the program, with partnership requiring willingness to compromise on both ends, with the agency and with the contractor. So moving forward with that, let's talk about contract duration. So contractors may initially show a decrease in performance in the first few years of a contract, after which time performance usually significantly improves. So it's been shown that within the first 2 years of new contractors either coming to this field or to a new area, they have about a 2-year learning curve. And so the contracts need to reflect this. If you have a 1-year contract and a new contractor, it's likely that you're not going to be hitting the performance targets that you'd like. So having a 3 or 5-year contract allows the contractor enough time to learn what they need to learn and grow and understand that area while meeting the needs of the agency. Contractors need training and they need time to learn as they go in those first few storm events and in the first few years. And contractors should be given sufficient time to make a return on their startup investment expenses. So what we've found is that the 3 to 5 year contracts with extensions based on success appear to be very effective. And interestingly enough, from the survey, we found that 90% of the agencies that responded have been using contracted services for 15 or more years. So that's a significant amount of time, and there's a wealth of information out there with folks that have been contracting for quite a while. A much smaller portion, about 10% of the folks that responded to the survey, have been contracting for 3 to 10 years. So a shorter amount of time, but long enough to observe that learning curve that the contractors need. One little tidbit that I found really interesting in this process is that from the literature review, there's not a lot of information specifically on winter maintenance contracting. The bulk of the information is on general maintenance contracting. And the contracts themselves can apply, but the application of information might be a little different. But what we found from the survey is that 63% of the contracts that were being used for winter maintenance were specifically written for winter maintenance. So there is a lot of information out there and a lot of resources for folks if you're interested in improving your program or learning what other folks have to say. So moving forward with qualifications and training for contracting work with snow and ice response. So we identified an interesting aspect of qualifications, which we term pre-qualifications. And that's where contractors ahead of the contracting need to meet certain requirements. And that may be proof of financing, staffing, equipment, experience, inspections, the cost quote, and insurance or bonding. And about 60% of the survey respondents indicated that they do use a pre-qualification process. Kind of a gold star example of pre-qualification is used in Canada, and it was highlighted also at the PNS conference. If you were able to attend that, I believe it was in Portland. And I'll just quickly go through this 3-tiered system that they use for pre-qualification. So it's a 3-tier process. If you don't meet the needs of one of the tiers, you can't move on. And the first tier is that the contractor needs to demonstrate sufficient insurance and bonding. And this is pass or fail. Either you have it or you don't. If you have it, you may move on to tier 2. And for tier 2, they've defined it as the service proposal. And this is where the contractor would demonstrate how they will do the work, the number of plows or vehicles and equipment that they have, the staff, where the yards are relative to where they can get materials, store their equipment, and the different routes that they'd be servicing and how they would do that. In this example, they've assigned 30% of tier 2, or the score would count as 30% towards their final amount. But the contractor needs to at least get a minimum score in this tier 2 to move on. That being a check in the system that if contractors apply and they don't reach this minimum score, they need to go back and reassess their proposal before they can propose again. So if the contractor meets that minimum score in tier 2, they can then move on to tier 3, which is the final pre-qualification. And this would be the cost quote. And in this example, the cost quote is worth 70% of the final score. So in this area, they have determined that the cost quote is more important and is worth that 70% amount. The proposal with the highest score wins the contract in this example. And these can be modified to meet your needs. What's interesting is that most state agencies did not have a demanding pre-qualification or training criteria for contractors involved in snow and ice control. What we found is that about half of the survey respondents indicated that contractors' personnel need to have experience or approved training, but also that about half indicated that once the contractors have been funded, Additional training of their personnel is not required. And what we found from the survey is that about 35% of the agencies indicated that yes, they require training and they will pay for it. And 13% indicated that yes, they require training and know that they will not pay for it. But to me, what really is highlighted here is that about 52% of the agencies do not require training. Some examples of experience or approved training that some of the agencies indicated that they use or require of contracting contractors include CDLs or commercial driver's license. One agency required 2 years of plowing and spreading experience, and another agency required training from the contractors or the agency prior to the winter season beginning. And you could require all of these or none of these, as some folks have indicated. What this means is that agencies are hiring contracted employees who may have little or no training in snow and ice control operations. In particular, seasonal or part-time employees hired through the contractors may have insufficient experience to adequately handle snow and ice control activities. And this may be reflected in that 1 to 2 year learning curve that we're seeing with new contractors coming in. So moving forward into equipment and snow and ice control materials. What we found is that private contractors tend to use their own equipment, while contracted local public agencies share their equipment with the state DOTs. From the survey, about 88% of the agencies that responded indicated that their contractors provide their own equipment for snow and ice control. And of these 88% of agencies where that occurs, about 83% of the contractors are responsible for their own equipment calibration. And about 72% of the 88% of contractors' equipment need to be maintained or the agency requires the contractor maintain the equipment to a minimum standard. And that standard may be enforced by routine mechanical inspections or calibration of spreaders. And these may or may not be supervised by agency staff. And if that is something that is important to you, it should be written into the contract that either calibration occurs or equipment is inspected and maintained in a routine fashion. Interestingly, about 12% of survey respondents indicated that no equipment calibration is required. And the reason we think that's interesting is because some of these contracts go to the detail of specifying application rates. And if you're going to specify an application rate that vendors should be using for specific conditions, you also then should be recommending calibration. Because if your vehicle is not calibrated, there's no way to ensure that those appropriate application rates are being hit. So private contractors are most commonly provided snow and ice control materials by the agencies, whereas the local public agencies, it appears to be that they are encouraged to purchase their own materials and are then reimbursed. And what we found from the survey is that about 55% of the agencies responded provide snow and ice control materials to the private contractors. And that could be rock salt or brine, sand, or any other liquid chemical. And from the survey, only about 20% of the contractors that agencies work with provide their own material. Some other options that were provided in the survey responses included that contractors were purchasing some of the materials they wanted, but then agencies were providing the other. And in this example, the agency had a contract for rock salt, and so the contractor would use rock salt from the agency. But then if the contractor wanted to use a different product, such as a cold temperature modified liquid, the contractor could purchase that as a part of their own PO and use both materials. Whereas local agencies were given the option to procure their own products, and then were reimbursed based on the amount that they used on the contract with the agency. So moving forward with cost, the cost of contracting. At this time, it's not clear if costs associated with contracting for snow and ice control operations are greater than using in-house services. Cost information is not often compared on an apples-to-apples basis, and confounding factors such as level of service expectations can really complicate the analysis. What we found from the survey is that only about 25% of the agencies that responded have performed formal cost-benefit analysis between contracted services and their own in-house services. Two examples that were provided from the survey, one from New Hampshire, found an increase in costs associated with using contracted services, and they just compared a basic hourly rate, whereas a comparison that was done by Massachusetts found a 30 to 40% increase in costs when using contracted services. Now, what we don't know are the details of these, and we don't know if the level of service expectations between the in-house services and the contracted services were the same. What we do know from the survey, though, is that about 41% of people that responded, or agencies that responded, felt or reported that contracted services cost more, whereas only about 12% of the respondents indicated that contracted services cost less. So regardless of the true cost, cost appears to be associated with the level of service that's provided. So the higher the level of service that's provided, the higher the cost. And if you are going to contracted services for snow and ice response because your level of service requirements have increased, then it is likely that regardless of who is doing the work, the cost will increase. So moving forward into safety issues and experiences. Most agencies either think that there is no difference in accident rates or that they do not track accident rates when comparing in-house versus contracted services. With that being said, about 65% of the survey responding agencies have set safety standards in their contracts for the contractors, but 35% did not. So that 35% of those contracts with those private firms are putting safety standards solely on the contractor. Some examples of what safety standards have been used include monitoring speed during plowing and application, mandated drug and alcohol testing, lighting requirements for vehicles used for snow and ice control operations, any safety standards that are associated with CDLs, and guidance on bridges. And this is just an example of some of the safety standards, not all of them. But really what it comes down to is accident rate data and collecting it and who has it. Interestingly, none of the responding agencies to the survey reported a decrease in accident rates with the use of contracted services. But with that being said, about 70% of the responding agencies indicated that contractors are responsible for any damage, and that's life and property, during snow and ice control operations. So if contractors are responsible for handling damage to vehicles and life or injuries that occur, are they required to report that to the agency? And if they're not required, are they doing it in good faith? So if you truly want to get to the heart of accident rates and safety between in-house and contracted services, consider writing into the contract that the contractor or their insurance company needs to report back to the agency the data that's collected. Most agencies have very good accident rate data, whether they keep track of it as accident rate data or as money spent on repairs and incidents that occur or from litigation. And if those numbers are what you're requiring, you need to then request that information from the contractor. In some cases where you're using local public agencies to contract work, the state agency may cover life and property damage as long as there was not a disregard for general safety operations. Moving forward into emergency management, I think this was a driving force in part behind this project due to kind of the extreme storms that folks have been experiencing in the last decade. And what we're defining as emergency management is response to a storm or a series of storms of intensity, accumulation, and duration such that the agency and contractors are overwhelmed and they need additional support to manage the situation. And in this case, agencies may call upon additional contractors with extra or special capabilities who normally are not involved in normal snow and ice response. So this may be summer contractors that do weed control or trimming in the right-of-way with bucket trucks, or paving companies that have graders and front-end loaders that could be used in an emergency situation. From the survey, we found that about 32% of the respondents in their contracts that the contractors are responsible for deploying additional resources in these emergency situations, and that the contractors are then reimbursed for this additional effort. But interestingly, about 26% indicated that contractors are responsible for deploying and managing these emergency situations, but that the contractor has to bear this additional cost. Now, this 26% that coordinates the emergency effort and bears the cost, these normally occur within the longer-term contracts. And so the cost is folded into the long-term contract cost. And that in a lean year without an extreme event, you would hope that the contractor would then save or bank funds for when an emergency situation does occur. But this highlights the importance of going over the contract with the contractor ahead of each winter season and reminding them of the terms of the contract, if they're responsible for emergency management and if they're responsible for the cost of it as well. About 16% of survey respondents indicated that the agencies, the state agencies, actually provide the additional resources, and this may be labor and equipment, and this can be from other parts of the state to the contractor. And an additional 26% of respondents indicated that emergency deployments are not required by contracted forces at all, and so the state and local agencies would handle that. But again, I'd like to reiterate that the terms of the contracts need to be understood well in advance of these emergency situations so that the clear communication and understanding of expectations can occur. Again, the agencies tend to not pay additional costs for long-term contracts involved in emergency deployments, whereas when local agencies are involved and short-term contracts are used, additional costs can be paid out, or in the example of local agencies, they can use shared resources. In that situation where contractors are not involved with the emergency deployment, about 30% of the agencies recruit additional contracts specifically for emergency deployment. And so that would be a situation where maybe the summer paving contractor is called up and asked to help, or the tree trimmers are asked to come out and help clean up debris. One respondent indicated that they bring in resources from unaffected districts during emergency deployments. I think this is far more common than was indicated in the survey, just because I've heard about it in the news quite a bit. But it's a great resource for folks to consider ahead of time when developing an emergency management plan. Another important component of emergency management and contract services is FEMA compliance. So when agencies develop contracts, they should comply with rules and requirements governing procurement, documentation, and payment in order to aid in receiving federal disaster aid. So if a federal disaster is declared, you want to make sure that your contracts comply with that. And I believe if you do it ahead of time, then you can just seamlessly go into that, and it should be an easier process. And this should consider all possible contractors, negotiate expected work and rates ahead of time. And so that would really be maybe ahead of the storm or setting a summer meeting to brainstorm potential storms that may occur or emergency situations, how they could be handled, contractors that would be needed, and potential costs. And that way there's a framework in place and potentially even a list of contractors that you have to call out if this should occur. So moving forward into incentives and disincentives in the contracting process. In general, we found that incentives and disincentives are not commonly used, and this is based on our survey responses. So they may be used in certain areas, but based on our survey responses, they don't appear to be used that often. But incentives that were indicated as being used included incentives for purchasing of upgraded equipment or technology, providing financing arrangements and options for specific pieces of equipment, incentives for training and specific certifications related to snow and ice control, or incentives and disincentives associated with the performance of the contractor. And those could be based on material usage or time to bare pavement, whatever your performance or level of service standard is in that contract. Generally, incentives are seen as an increase in pay rates or bonuses, financial bonuses to the contractor. And these are generally occurring only to the private contractor, not to the local agency. And disincentives can be a whole range of activities, but may include termination of the contract. And as previously mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, about 50% of responding agencies have had to terminate contracts. So there is a need for incentive and disincentive programs potentially. So what's interesting is that contracts can be structured to include these incentives and disincentives based on performance. An example that was highlighted in the literature occurred in the National Highway System in the District of Columbia. They had a performance bonus set up in their contract, and in part due to the bonus system that they had, they were able to observe a 300% increase in the overall rating of the highway, so the snow and ice control performance on that highway over time. So it appears in this situation that the incentive program really worked with this contractor. We also asked agencies in the survey if they use incentives for encouraging the use of advanced technologies, and about 20% of folks that responded said that they did. And in some cases, the advanced technologies are mandated in the contract, or that the agency actually provides the advanced technology to the contractor to use. So moving forward, some lessons learned that were garnered from the survey include the importance of mutual understanding between the contractor and the agency. And this would be in the form of very comprehensive contracts that are detailed and specific regarding the equipment, expectations, monitoring of the snow and ice equipment and material, training of personnel to manage the contract. So this isn't actually training the contractors. This is having agency staff that are trained to work directly with the contractors to manage them from the agency side. Being very clear and including expectations in the contract so that the contractor knows exactly what's expected of them. And then one person actually suggested fully giving up control and direction to the contractors, and that this may provide a sense of ownership to the contractors in terms of the quality and level of service that's provided on that road. Some effective practices that were identified in the literature review include developing a working partnership between the state and the contractor, and that could be the local public agency you work with or the private contractor. And again, reiterating the need for very clear communication and clear contract terms and conditions. Identifying performance standards for various storm durations or storm types, and that could be in terms of labor hours, equipment needs, or material types, and being very clear if this is an important piece of information for your agency to give that to the contractor. And again, just being clear and concise with your contracts. Really, the nugget here is that to adopt contract language that maximizes the opportunity and responsibility for the contracted party to prove their own responsiveness, their efficiency, and their effectiveness in producing snow and ice response to the public. So allowing the contractor, giving them the space and the opportunity to do the best possible job they can do. So with all that being said, I'm going to quickly summarize the major points from the report, and then we'll get into a short question and answer period. So generally speaking, when using contracting for snow and ice control, information is available on general maintenance, but rarely is there information specifically addressing contracting for winter maintenance operations. And that really highlights the importance of our survey findings, which are tailored specifically to winter maintenance contracting. The main reasons agencies are seeking contractors for snow and ice response include a lack of resources within the agency, a state-level movement towards outsourcing or privatization, or cost comparisons. And as we discussed previously, cost data is not great and it's challenging to process, and not a lot of folks are doing the true cost-benefit analysis. So be very careful and clear if cost is your reasoning for going to or away from contracting snow and ice response. Winter maintenance agencies are typically using four main types of contracts, and those include rental agreements or the short-term contracts, defined amount of work or recurring work contracts, blended forces contracts, and asset management and public-private partnership contracts. Performance-based maintenance contracts are a contracting option. Based on our survey responses, they're not commonly used, and it does not appear that people want to use them in the future, but they provide a framework and an option for contracts that pay out based on performance. So winter maintenance agencies can set a minimum level of service, such as a response time, to measure the performance. But you could set your performance measure however you'd like. It could be friction, it could be amount of material used, it could be response time as 12-hour regain time, whatever your metric is, but it should be written into the contract clearly regardless. In most cases, winter maintenance agencies rely on contractors for snow and ice equipment, whereas the agency itself commonly provides the snow and ice control material to the private contractor. Studies have shown that there's a need for a minimum standard for equipment used by the contractors, such that your contract may want to have a replacement time of aging equipment or an upgrading to new technology clause within it. It's generally perceived that in urbanized areas that have higher density, there may actually be a higher density of good quality contracting firms to provide contracts for snow and ice response. However, what we were able to find from the survey responses in the literature is that contractors are willing to work in remote and rural areas if the size and duration of the contract meets their needs or is large enough to justify moving equipment and potentially moving people to a location for that season. It's generally perceived that contracting potentially reduces the cost for highway winter maintenance options. However, the benefits of using in-house versus contracted services may be more qualitative than quantitative. So the qualitative benefits of using these in-house staff may be local knowledge, institutional knowledge, a willingness to put a little more time and energy into a road that they have to personally drive down every day because they live in that neighborhood. Whereas the quantitative aspect of it would be more the hard numbers of safety and cost. Evidence of contracting resulting in improved level of service is inconclusive at this point in time based on the information that's out there. Studies have reported that contractors either have improved level of service compared to in-house or provide the same level of service. But this could greatly vary based on your agency and even local and regional issues and your level of service requirements of your in-house staffing versus your contractors. However, there's a high chance of decreased performance in the first few years of using a new contractor. And this is very important to consider when moving a contractor to a new location or having a new contractor come in. You have to expect that there will be a decreased performance in those first couple of years as they work through that learning curve. And so if you are going to do a level of service comparison of these, I would encourage it to be a long-term study over maybe 3 to 4 years instead of 1 to 2 years to give the contractor a fair shot at comparing to those in-house services. Winter maintenance agencies have quality control measures in the contracts that ensure that the contractors are providing the best possible level of service. And these quality control measures can be written however your agency needs them to read and can be individually tailored to your needs. And this has been achieved through well-defined goals and objectives for the contractors. And again, these should be reviewed by the contractor and the agency together ahead of time, so there's clear understanding of expectations. And in some cases of poor performance by contractors, winter maintenance agencies have either had to penalize contractors, terminate the contractor, or revert to in-house services. But again, what we found is that those folks that are reverting to in-house services are only doing it partially and only doing it because they can't find a contractor that's available to meet their needs. So with all that said, the final part of the project was to make recommendations based on the information of where the greatest improvement could be found or research or data needs on this topic. And so I'm just going to highlight a few of the recommendations that we make in the final report. So when contracting for snow and ice response, the contract language should consider addressing the responsibility of equipment calibration, how often equipment should be calibrated, and who is responsible for the calibration. We feel like this is an area where large improvements could be seen in accuracy of application. The reason we feel that this small piece could add great value to these contracts is if you provide to the contractor application guidelines or application rates for materials, but you don't require them to calibrate their equipment, there's no way for you to know if they're actually hitting the mark or not. And this could be important if you have a sensitive area or you have sensitive infrastructure that you're trying to protect. Additionally, this can equate to cost savings if they're using your product in their equipment. They could potentially be using significantly more product than they need to be. To ensure the highest level of snow and ice response, the contracting agency should consider using a pre-qualification process for the contractors and should also consider annual training for contracted staff. And this could be ahead of the contract being awarded and then after or during the contract is being executed. Available cost data related to the use of contracted services for snow and ice response is inconclusive whether it is more cost-effective to use in-house services or contracted services at this point in time. We recommend that cost data be collected and compared between in-house staff and contracted services, and that when you do this, or if you choose to do this, that you make every effort to compare costs on even terms. So an apples to apples comparison, operator costs, equipment costs, material costs, similar level of service expectations, trying to really evenly compare these so that you know in your area where the cost data truly falls. And there appears to be a lack of available data on safety and performance of contracted snow and ice response as compared to the use of in-house resources. And again, this may just be a function of the contractor being responsible for their own safety and paying out on any accidents, whether it's equipment or bodily injury, and collecting that data from the contractor or the insurance company. So if this appeals to you, you may need to modify your contract language to include collection of this data. We recommend, if you're interested, either doing an in-house safety analysis or analysis of the safety data, or getting help from someone to do that, and looking at accident rates between in-house and contracted services staff. I will open the floor at this point for questions.
Okay, I think Clay from Kent. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh,
Clay, do you want to? Yeah.
I'm going to read through the question right now, but Clay, if you want to provide any background on this.
Basically, I think he's just asking that when we're talking about the number of, when you offer up a percentage, we're talking about the percentage of the actual states that responded. I think you had, what, 31 responses?
So yeah, that's correct. Yeah, one of the comments in the survey summary was that, I'm going to move this box really quick, that we include a response count. So even though we had 51 survey respondents, only 60% of those use contracted services. So you're correct. When we're talking about 90% of the people that use a specific kind of contract, it's 90% of that 60%. So here we have the actual count for how many people represent that percentage amount, and that's been added to every single table and can be seen in the final report. I didn't include all of the tables in this presentation, but I can include the response or the number of respondents in the survey if you would like. I'm happy to do that.
So when throughout the rest of this presentation, whenever you referred to a percentage, it was that same format, right?
Correct. Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. And the next question comes from Joe Bucci in Rhode Island. Joe, do you want to read your question, or do you want? I can do it if you don't want to.
No, I was just curious if during when you were talking about cost, if you had any average cost. Like we use a lot of winter vendors, but it's on they voluntarily sign up, and it's hourly rates based on how their trucks are equipped. So we've gotten a lot less vendors to sign up this year than in past years, and I was just curious to see if there was any cost information by region to see how we compare. If, you know, if we're paying too little, maybe I can use that as a justification to try to raise our rates a little bit.
That's a really good question. We asked for cost data, and we did not receive any. And I think that's a function of folks just not having time. It was a long survey to begin with, so having folks go back and dig through cost data, we didn't get it. But what I can do is I can provide to you all the states that do contract, and if you want to contact those folks directly, I'm sure that they will share contracting cost data. What I kind of hear from you, though, is that you're looking for information from each state, almost like the map that you guys make in Clear Roads with what people pay for salt. And it would be really great if people could report, you know, what they pay for contractors. But I don't know how those rates are protected within the contracting world.
Yeah.
And maybe what we can do is just put it out to Clear Roads in a general email and see if folks can respond to you about, you know, how the contracts are broken down, whether it's a lump sum or an hourly rate or a per mile rate, and what those amounts are. I would imagine it would vary highly regionally based on just local costs. But
right. Yeah, and that's kind of what I was getting at. And the other thing that makes it difficult, if someone were to ask, you know, I could probably put together an average based on vehicle type, but it's tough because no two trucks are really built the same. Like we pay differently for different types of equipment, plow sizes, spreader sizes, saddle tanks. Like they basically build a truck, and we put dollar amounts with all the different things. So it can get pretty complicated to try to get cost information, at least for us, the way that we do it. So I just figured I would ask.
I mean, does anyone on the line want to respond to Joe?
Joe, that might
okay.
be, I was going to say, Joe, that might be a good question, like the way Laura mentioned it. It could be something we put out to the group, one of those internal questions where you get a response back, or maybe it's even, depending on the amount of detail you want there, that could even be a synthesis idea for the spring meeting.
Okay.
All right, I think that's all the questions we have on the chat box. Does anybody else have any questions before we sign off? Okay, hearing none, I'm going to thank Laura Fay again for her work on this project. The draft final report is being reviewed, and it's soon to be finalized, and we'll go ahead and get that posted. The webinar, as I said, is being recorded right now, and that will also be posted probably sometime next week on the website. And Laura, do you have anything else before we sign off?
I'd just like to encourage folks, if they have not had an opportunity yet, to provide comments on any task or the final report. Please do that. This is kind of your final opportunity to help craft the final document that gets published. So we look forward to hearing from everyone.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining in today, and have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you soon.